There are stories buried deep in the Appalachian mountains that no one dares to tell aloud. Secrets whispered in the trees, names carved into bark, and bloodlines that should have ended long ago. Tonight, you're about to hear one of those stories. The Sutterfield Inbreeding scandal, Appalachia's most isolated family secret. But before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. The hollow lay deep in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, a place where the sun seemed reluctant to pour itself fully, where mist clung to the ridges long after morning had broken. Dirt roads twisted like veins through the dense cover of oak and pine, and cabins crouched low against the earth as if bracing for storms. It was here, tucked in a pocket of Clay County, that the Sutterfields had endured for longer than anyone could rightly recall. Locals claimed the family line went back to the first squatters who came over the ridges in the late 18th century, men and women too stubborn, or too weary, to keep pressing westward. They found a spring-fed hollow, fertile enough for corn and hogs, remote enough to be forgotten, and they stayed. The name Sutterfield, scratched into the county's earliest church records, was attached to marriages that never reached beyond the hollow, births that rarely made it to courthouse books, and deaths whispered about rather than recorded. By the late 19th century, whispers thickened into warnings. Travelers who wandered too far into the backwoods claimed to have seen pale children with eyes too wide for their faces, or grown men with the slouched gait of boys. A merchant who carried salt and flour up from town said he was offered payment in chickens, moonshine, and once in a handful of teeth. "They don't come down," the merchant told his wife, "and best you pray they don't." Isolation pressed heavy on the Sutterfields. The ridge that shielded their hollow also walled them off. Winters cut deep, rains washed out what few paths connected them to the county seat, and the nearest schoolhouse sat a 2-day walk away. Survival meant marrying kin, raising what children came, and burying the rest in soil so stony that coffins were often made shallow and roots tangled with bones. The matriarch of the clan, by the dawn of the 20th century, was a woman named Hester Sutterfield. Her hair turned white before her 40th year, and her face, lined and stern, seemed carved out of the same shale that broke through the ground in jagged slabs. Hester bore 9 children, 5 of whom lived, and she raised them with the kind of iron will demanded by a hollow that gave little and asked much. Her eldest son, Ezra, grew into a man with sloping shoulders and a sharpness in his jaw that made him appear always on the edge of anger. He married his cousin, Miriam, a union that drew no surprise among the family. To outsiders it might have seemed strange, even alarming, but in the hollow it was not questioned. It was simply how things were, and how they had been for as long as anyone could recall. Stories began to drift outward, carried on the tongues of hunters and trappers who strayed too close. The Sutterfield children, they said, spoke in a dialect so tangled it was near unintelligible, their words more grunt than speech. Some swore the family feared the daylight, preferring to move through the woods in dusk or dawn, figures melting into shadow. Others whispered of screams at night, of fires that burned not for warmth, but for rituals no one dared describe. And yet, for all the rumors, the Sutterfields remained untouched. The law had little reason to climb the ridge. The church's sermons could not carry that far. The hollow swallowed them, kept them, and in that keeping, the family wound tighter upon itself. Generations stacked upon generations, marriages folded into bloodlines already thick with kinship. By the time the First World War stirred the outside world, the Sutterfields remained unmoved. No sons were drafted, for no census had their names. No letters arrived, for no post was carried that far. The hollow kept its secret, and the family within it kept theirs. But secrets, like water behind a dam, do not stay quiet forever. The first crack came in the spring of 1919, when a boy named Elias Sutterfield stumbled into town. His hair was long and matted, his clothes reeked of smoke and mud, and his eyes were wide with something the townsfolk mistook for madness. He begged for bread at the door of the mercantile, and when asked his name, he spoke it in a low rasp that carried like a ghost. Sutterfield. The name struck like a match. The town, which had nearly forgotten the family except in hushed rumour, suddenly remembered too well. Mothers clutched their children, the sheriff's jaw tightened, and the preacher muttered a prayer under his breath. Elias was taken in for the night, given a pallet on the floor of the jail, and fed beans and cornbread until his belly swelled. In the quiet dark, with the sheriff half asleep at his desk, Elias began to talk. His words tumbled out in a stream, broken, halting, but urgent. He spoke of sickness in the hollow, of children born with twisted limbs, of hunger so fierce they boiled bark into broth. And then he said something that made the sheriff sit up straight, his pipe clattering to the floorboards. "They won't let me leave," Elias whispered. "They don't let nobody leave." The sheriff stared at him for a long time, the weight of the words pressing hard against the silence. Outside, the town lay still, the mountains rising like black walls against the sky. Somewhere beyond those ridges, in the hollow, the Sutterfields waited, and for the first time in a century, the outside world began to wonder if it was ready to know what lay hidden in their shadows. The morning after Elias's arrival, the jailhouse buzzed with more life than it had seen in months. Townsfolk lingered outside, pretending to loiter near the mercantile or the smithy, their eyes straying again and again toward the door where the boy slept. Children were pulled back by cautious mothers, though the curiosity in their faces was a mirror of the adults. Sheriff Nathaniel Vance sat at his desk, hat in his hands, considering the boy. Elias stirred now and then in his sleep, muttering words that came out like half-forgotten prayers. When he woke, his hunger was as bottomless as the day before, and the sheriff allowed him another tin plate of beans. "Boy," Vance said, his voice steady but edged with something uneasy, "you best tell me the truth. How'd you come down from that hollow? Folks say it's near impassable this time of year." Elias kept his eyes on the plate. He spoke between hurried mouthfuls. "Slipped the ridge. Took me 3 nights. Walked till my feet bled. Hid from M." "Who's them?" Elias looked up. His eyes, pale grey like fog on the mountain, held a fevered light. "Them as don't want nobody leavin'. Family." The sheriff pressed, but Elias shut down after that, as if a door had slammed inside him. He huddled in the corner of the cell, clutching the thin blanket, his shoulders trembling though the morning was warm. Word of the boy spread faster than wildfire through the small town. At the church service that Sunday, Preacher Holcomb spoke carefully of the sins of isolation, of how the devil thrived in the dark places men abandoned to him. Though he did not speak the family name, every ear in the wooden pews heard it echo anyway. Sutterfield. After service, a cluster of men gathered near the steps, whispering with lowered voices. Merchants, farmers, hunters, they all had stories of the hollow, scraps of rumour, half-seen glimpses. But none could boast of truly knowing the Sutterfields, and that ignorance hung like a weight on them all. The sheriff knew better than to fan gossip into flames, but something about the boy gnawed at him. Elias was not simply wild or strange. There was a desperation in him that could not be ignored. When he asked if Elias wanted to stay in town, the boy only shook his head and muttered, "Can't stay. They'll come." 2 nights later, a dog barked long into the dark hours, its growl stretching toward the woods. The sheriff, half asleep on his cot, roused to the sound of boots scuffing against gravel. By the time he stepped outside, lantern in hand, he saw nothing but shadows bending in the tree line. At dawn, the boy was gone. The cell door still locked, the window still barred, yet the pallet was empty, the blanket neatly folded. On the rough wood, carved by some hurried hand, was a single word scratched deep enough to splinter. "Run." The sheriff said little of it. To some he muttered that Elias must have slipped away during the night, back to the ridge he had come from. But to others, the preacher, the judge, the men who had gathered on the church steps, he admitted he feared the boy had not left by choice. For weeks, the town carried on with unease, as if waiting for something to stir from the mountains. Hunters reported fewer deer in the thickets. A widow claimed she heard chanting at dusk, carried on the wind, and a young girl swore she saw figures standing at the edge of a field, silent, watching, until her father fired his rifle and the shapes melted back into the trees. Then, one rain-heavy evening, a horse came down the road without a rider. Its flanks were slick with mud, its eyes wide and rolling. Around its neck was a length of rope, frayed at the end as though cut. The horse belonged to one of the town's trappers, a man named Saul Drummond, who had gone up toward the ridge 3 days earlier and had not returned. Search parties were formed. Men with lanterns and rifles combed the woods. They found no body, no trace of Saul, only the ash of a fire that had burned down to cinders. Beside it lay a small pile of bones, too small for a man, too large for a rabbit. No one spoke aloud what they feared it might be. The sheriff knew then that the hollow no longer held its secrets alone. Something had stirred, something that had seeped beyond its ridges. And though no man wished it, the town and the Sutterfields were bound now, tethered by a boy who had whispered of family that would not let him go. The mountain kept its silence, but the silence was louder than any scream. Autumn came heavy that year, draping the mountains in red and gold, yet the beauty of the season did little to ease the unease that had taken hold of Clay County. The disappearance of Saul Drummond lingered in every tavern whisper, every creak of the woods at night. Men walked home with rifles slung over their shoulders, women latched their shutters against shadows, and children were warned not to wander beyond the beaten paths. The Sutterfields had always been a distant rumour, an echo from the ridges, but now their presence pressed close, suffocating. It was as though the hollow itself had reached out a hand, curling it around the town, reminding them it had always been there, unseen but waiting. Sheriff Vance wore the strain in his face. He had lived his whole life beneath the ridges, hearing tales passed down like warnings in a hymn. Yet Elias's brief presence and the trapper's disappearance had transformed stories into threat. Every time he looked at the scratched word in the jail, "Run," a chill threaded his spine. Preacher Holcomb was less cautious. On the second Sunday after Saul's horse returned riderless, the preacher took the pulpit with a fire none had heard from him before. His voice boomed against the church rafters as he spoke of sin that festers in secrecy, of families that turn inward until the blood rots. "God sees what is done in the hollow," he thundered. He sees the children twisted by pride, the hunger that drives men to unholy feasts, the darkness that masquerades as kinship, and he will not be mocked. No one needed him to speak the name. The congregation sat stiff, their eyes flicking toward the windows, as though expecting shapes to appear beyond the glass. That night, a meeting was called at the sheriff's office. Farmers, merchants, hunters, even the schoolmaster, all pressed into the room, the lantern light throwing restless shadows across their faces. "They're not coming down here unless they mean harm," one man muttered. "They already took Saul," another snapped. "You don't know that," the sheriff answered, though the certainty in his voice was thin. Voices rose, fear twisting into anger. Some demanded a posse be sent to the hollow, to confront the family and put an end to whatever evil brewed there. Others urged caution, arguing that no good had ever come of meddling with the Sutterfields. Then old Mary Klein spoke. She was nearly 70, her hair thin and white, her voice fragile as frost. Yet when she stood, the room fell silent. "I knew Hester," Mary said. "Knew her when we were girls. She was proud even then, proud and hard. I seen her once, years later, carrying a babe that didn't look right, eyes too far apart, skin pale as ash. She said nothing, just held it close. I never saw the child again. Never saw any of them after that. They don't bury in town, you know. They keep their dead in the hollow." The room stirred with unease. Mary lowered her gaze. "If you go up there, you won't come back the same. If you come back at all." The meeting broke with no decision, only a heaviness that followed each man home. Yet beneath their fear, a resolve began to harden. For generations they had turned their eyes from the hollow, content to let it rot in its own shadows. But now, with Saul gone and the boy Elias vanished like smoke, the line between the town and the Sutterfields no longer held. The mountains had shifted, the hollow had stirred, and the people knew it would not rest again. 2 nights later, another sound joined the whispers of the ridge. A keening cry, high and thin, drifting down into the valley like the wail of a mourning mother. It rose and fell through the darkness, so unearthly that men clenched their fists against trembling. Women pressed hands over their children's ears. When dawn came, a hunter found a bundle at the edge of the creek. Wrapped in a strip of burlap, stiff with dried blood, lay a newborn child. Its chest did not rise, its eyes sealed forever shut. The hunter swore he had never seen the like, not in any human child. Its limbs were too short, its skull oddly shaped, its tiny mouth frozen open in a silent cry. Pinned to the burlap with a wooden splinter was a scrap of paper, smeared with mud and scrawled in an unsteady hand. "Take it. It don't belong." The sheriff ordered it buried before sunset. No record kept, no word spread beyond the town. But secrecy was no shield anymore. Fear had already taken root, and with it came the creeping certainty that the Sutterfields were no longer merely a family hidden in the hollow. They were coming closer, and the town had no choice but to face them. The men met under the cover of dusk, lanterns hooded, voices low. They gathered in the loft of the livery, the smell of hay and horses pressing close, as though the very air sought to remind them of their tether to the earth. Fear had eaten at them long enough, and now it had ripened into something harder, resolve. Sheriff Vance did not call the meeting, but neither did he stop it. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his hat low over his eyes, listening as farmers and hunters spoke of Saul Drummond, of the dead infant left by the creek, of Elias's warning carved into the jailhouse wood. "We can't sit here waiting on him to come down," growled Tom Hensley, a man broad as an ox. his fists scarred from years at the anvil. "They took Saul, they'll take more. Best we go up there and put an end to whatever deviltry they're breedin'." Others muttered agreement, yet some hung back, unease etched into their faces. "That hollow's theirs," said schoolmaster Ephraim Miller, his thin hands trembling. "It's always been theirs. You walk into it, you walk into their world. Ain't no law up there but the one they made." "And what law's that?" snapped Hensley. "Blood for blood. We can't let it stand." Preacher Holcomb raised his hand, his eyes bright with fervor. "This is not a matter of law. It is a matter of sin. That family has turned inward until their blood runs foul. The Lord himself cries against it. If men will not act, then evil will grow unchecked." The sheriff finally spoke, his voice low, steady, but weighted. "You go up that ridge. You best be ready for what you'll find. I can't promise I'll bring you all back." Despite his words, 10 men swore themselves to the task before dawn. They gathered rifles, shotguns, hunting knives. Mothers wept quietly as they kissed their husbands' foreheads. Children stared wide-eyed as fathers knelt to murmur promises they did not believe. At sunrise, the posse set out. The ridge loomed ahead, a jagged spine against the pale sky, its slopes cloaked in oak and pine. The air grew colder as they climbed, the earth soft with rotting leaves. Bird song dwindled. Even the wind seemed to hush. By mid-morning, they reached a clearing marked by a crooked oak split by lightning. The sheriff raised his hand, halting the men. "From here," he said, "we're in their country." The path narrowed, winding through thickets so dense the men had to walk single file. They passed a rusted still, long abandoned, and a pile of animal bones strung together on a line as though hung to dry. The bones rattled softly in the breeze, a hollow clatter that quickened their steps. Then came the first sign. A doll, crudely stitched from burlap and stuffed with corn husks, dangled from a tree limb by a noose of twine. Its face was drawn in charcoal, 2 black eyes and a jagged mouth. Beneath it, nailed to the tree trunk, was a wooden board carved with shaky letters. "Turn back." The men shifted uneasily. Hensley spat in the leaves. "Scare tactics," he muttered, but even he gripped his shotgun tighter. Deeper they went. The forest thickened, light thinning to a dim glow. The ground sloped downward, the air damp with the smell of moss and stagnant water. And then, faint at first but growing clearer, came a sound, a low humming like a chant carried on many voices. The sheriff raised his hand again, crouching low. The men followed, straining to listen. The chant was rhythmic, steady, rising and falling in tones that seemed almost inhuman. They crept forward until the trees opened into a hollow. Cabins leaned against one another like drunks, their roofs patched with tar and rusted tin. Smoke curled from chimneys, though the fires smelled not of pine but of something acrid, sour. In the center, around a pit dug deep into the earth, the Sutterfields gathered. Men, women, children, all thin, pale, their faces a strange mix of sharp and slack, features repeated from one to the next as though stamped from the same mold. Their clothes hung in tatters, their feet bare on the cold ground. The chanting swelled, their bodies swaying. In the pit, flames licked at something unrecognizable, bones, hair, rags. The smell clawed at the men's throats. Then one of the Sutterfields lifted his head. His eyes, milky and unfocused, turned directly toward the trees. One by one, the others followed, the chant tapering into silence. The air grew so still the men could hear their own hearts beating. Sheriff Vance felt it in his bones before a word was spoken. They had been expected. And then, from the cluster of pale faces, a voice rasped through the hollow, old and sharp as broken glass. "Welcome home." The voice that cut through the hollow belonged to a figure who stepped forward from the circle of kin. She was bent with age, her back arched like a bowstring, but her presence commanded silence from the gathered Sutterfields. A ragged shawl hung from her shoulders, grey as ash, and her hair spilled down in long, matted strands the colour of snow. Hester Sutterfield. Even the sheriff, who had never laid eyes on her before, knew at once it was her. The name had lingered like smoke across decades. Hester, the matriarch, the root from which the twisted tree had grown. Her eyes, sharp and black as coal, swept across the men in the trees. Her mouth curled, not into a smile but into something colder, as though amusement and contempt had fused together. "You think you came of your own choosing," she rasped, her voice carrying clear despite its weakness. "But the mountain called you, same as it called your fathers, same as it called me. Ain't no leaving once you've heard it." The men shifted uneasily. Tom Hensley raised his shotgun, the barrel glinting faint in the grey light. "We come for answers," he said, his voice rough. "For Saul Drummond. For that babe left by the creek. For the boy who came down." A ripple of murmurs passed through the gathered Sutterfields. Some stared blankly, others smiled with lips too wide, too still. Hester tilted her head. "You come a skin of the dead. But the dead don't answer. Only the living do. And I tell you, Saul ain't yours no more. He's part of us now. Same as the babe, same as the boy. All who come to the hollow belong to it." Sheriff Vance stepped forward, his rifle lowered but ready. His voice was steady, though the weight of the moment pressed heavy on his chest. "You can't keep talking, folks. Whatever goes on up here, it ends tonight." Hester's laugh cracked the air, thin and brittle, yet somehow it carried. The sound rippled through the gathered kin, and soon their mouths opened too. Not laughter, but a low moan that rose and fell like the wind through the trees. "You think you're the first to try," she said when the sound faded. "Sheriffs come before you. Preachers, too. Hunters with guns and torches. They all come. And they all stayed." At her words, two of the kin stepped aside. From the shadow of a leaning cabin, they dragged something into the light. A bundle of rags, clotted with dirt, moved feebly. As the men squinted, the rags fell away just enough to reveal a face, half hidden by beard, eyes hollow, mouth working without sound. It was Saul Drummond, gaunt, broken, but alive. His skin was pale as parchment, his lips cracked and bleeding. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came out, a sound like a dry leaf dragged across stone. The posse stirred, anger and horror twisting their stomachs. Hensley raised his gun higher, but the sheriff caught his arm. One shot would bring the hollow alive, and they were outnumbered 10-1. Hester stepped closer, her bare feet sinking into the damp earth. "You want him?" she asked. "Take him, then. Take him back, and see what follows. See what seeds he sows." Her words carried an edge, as if Saul himself had become a weapon. The men hesitated, their courage thinning under the weight of something unseen but palpable, pressing against their lungs like heavy air. Then Hester's voice shifted, low and fierce, her eyes burning. "Blood binds us. Blood keeps us. And blood calls you, same as it calls all. You can climb down this ridge, but you'll never leave the hollow behind. It will follow you home, into your wives' beds, into your children's cradles, into your very marrow." The posse faltered, their resolve cracking like thin ice. For a moment, no one moved. Then Sheriff Vance raised his hand, signaling retreat. "We came for answers. We got 'em," he said, his voice tight. "We're leavin'. Hensley muttered curses, but he obeyed. One by one, the men backed away, rifles raised but unused. The Sutterfields did not move, did not follow. Only their eyes tracked the intruders, glowing faint in the half-light, until the trees swallowed the posse again. When they reached the clearing marked by the lightning-struck oak, the sheriff called a halt. The men stood in a circle, their breaths ragged, their faces pale. None spoke for a long while. Finally, Ephraim Miller broke the silence. His voice shook. "She's right. They ain't just in the hollow. They're in us now." Every man who looked her in the eye, every man who saw what's up there, "We're marked." The sheriff said nothing. He only looked back toward the ridge, where the trees swayed as if stirred by breath unseen, and the sound of low chanting echoed faintly across the distance. The hollow had not ended. It had only begun. In the days that followed the posse's return, Clay County did not rest. The men who had climbed the ridge walked the town like shadows of themselves. Their wives whispered of sleepless nights, of sudden fits of trembling, of eyes that stared too long into nothing. Children avoided their fathers, sensing the unease that clung to them like a second skin. Tom Hensley, once loud and brawny as an ox, grew quiet. He no longer sang at his anvil nor raised his voice at the tavern. Instead, he kept to his forge with the doors shut tight, the clang of hammer on iron echoing long into the night. Smoke poured from his chimney at hours when the town slept, and more than one passerby swore the smell was not iron, but something fouler. Ephraim Miller, the schoolmaster, stopped attending to his lessons. Children found him staring at the chalkboard, hand trembling as if writing words only he could see. He muttered under his breath, strange phrases that slipped into the room like draughts of cold air. Blood keeps, blood binds, blood calls. Parents pulled their children from the schoolhouse. By the week's end, the bell no longer rang. Even Sheriff Vance was not spared. He woke each night drenched in sweat, his dreams filled with the hollow, the chanting, the milky eyes, the hiss of Hester's voice promising that blood would follow. Each morning he found himself gripping his rifle without memory of reaching for it. Once at dawn, his wife woke to find him standing at their son's bedside, staring down at the sleeping boy with a look so vacant it frightened her to tears. The town felt the weight too. Chickens were found dead in their coops, their throats slit cleanly, no footprints in the dirt. Cattle lowed restlessly at night, their eyes rolling as if they sensed something lurking just beyond the fence line. A black dog appeared at the edge of the road, lean and silent, watching with eyes that reflected no light. No one claimed it, and no one dared chase it away. Then came the fever. It struck first in Hensley's house. His youngest daughter, only 6, woke one morning with her skin pale and mottled, her breath ragged. By nightfall she was gone. Within days, 2 more children fell ill, one from Miller's household, another from a farmer's down by the creek. The doctor, baffled, could only shake his head. "It ain't consumption," he muttered. "It ain't fever like I've ever seen. It's something else." At the funeral of the 3rd child, the preacher spoke of curses, his voice trembling. "The sins of the fathers visit upon the children," he cried, sweat shining on his brow. "We turned our faces from that hollow for too long, and now its shadow is upon us." The townsfolk did not need convincing. They had seen the way the posse returned, the way their eyes seemed marked, and they whispered now, in kitchens and parlours, that Hester had spoken true. The hollow had followed them home. Fear grew teeth. Men stopped going out after dark. Women nailed crosses over their doors. Children were told not to stray beyond the sight of their mothers. And yet, none of it seemed to matter. The air itself felt tainted, as if the ridge had exhaled a breath that settled over the valley. One night, as the sheriff sat at his desk with his head heavy in his hands, a knock came at the jailhouse door. He opened it to find Ephraim Miller standing in the rain, his face pale, his clothes soaked through. "They're callin' me," Miller whispered. His eyes, wide and glassy, flicked toward the ridge. "I hear 'em at night, chantin' my name in the chant, over and over." The sheriff tried to calm him, but Miller shook his head violently, water flying from his hair. "It won't stop till I go. Don't you see? They marked us. We belong now." He fled into the darkness before the sheriff could stop him. By dawn, his boots were found at the edge of the creek, neatly placed side by side. The footprints led into the water, and never came out. The hollow had reached down, claimed another, and left only silence in its wake. And the town knew, with a certainty that chilled their bones, that this was only the beginning. By the time autumn gave way to winter, Clay County was not the same town it had been. Doors that once stood open to neighbors were now barred at sundown. The tavern emptied earlier each night, laughter dying like a fire starved of air. The bell at the schoolhouse stayed silent, its windows dark. Yet the hollow did not stay quiet. At night, the chanting drifted again down the ridges, low, rhythmic, like the rumble of distant thunder. Sometimes it came faint as a whisper, other times it rolled so strong the very glass in windows trembled. Mothers pressed their children's ears, fathers gripped rifles they dared not fire. Then, one bitter night in December, Tom Hensley vanished. He had not been seen since dusk, when the glow of his forge burned bright. At sunrise, smoke no longer rose from the chimney. His wife, frantic, pushed open the heavy doors. The forge was cold, the tools scattered, and on the anvil lay something no one wished to see. A hammer slick with blood, a scrap of cloth torn from Hensley's work shirt, and carved deep into the iron beneath, the word, blood. The tracks led to the tree-lean and ended as if swallowed whole. No struggle, no trail, only silence. Fear gripped the town tighter than winter's frost. The sheriff called for men to search, though none volunteered readily. At last, 3 stepped forward, young, unwed, with no children to leave behind. They followed the tracks into the woods, lanterns casting weak halos against the dark. They did not return. By the next morning, their lanterns were found dangling from branches, each tied with strips of cloth torn from their own coats. No bodies. No voices. Only the lanterns, swaying in the cold wind, lightless. The town began to crumble beneath its fear. Some families packed wagons and left in haste, their wheels creaking down the frozen roads. Others refused to leave, clinging to the only home they had known, though their eyes bore the haunted look of prey. Preacher Holcomb thundered louder from his pulpit, his voice breaking as he railed against the hollow. "It is a pit of sin," he cried, slamming his fist against the Bible, "and the devil himself tends its flock. But the Lord tests us. He tests if we will stand firm or be devoured." Yet even he faltered when, one Sunday, only half the congregation filled the pews. By the following week, the doors of the church creaked in the wind, its benches nearly empty. And through it all, Sheriff Vance felt the weight of Hester's words pressing against his chest. "It will follow you home." He dreamed of her now, each night, the matriarch's black eyes staring into him, her voice rasping in his ears. "Blood binds us. Blood keeps us. Blood calls." He woke to find his own hands clenched so tight his nails drew blood. One night, his wife shook him from sleep, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Nathaniel," she whispered, "you were talking in your sleep again." "What did I say?" he asked, his voice raw. She swallowed hard. "You kept saying a name, over and over. Hester." The sheriff could not answer. He only sat in the dark until dawn broke, listening to the faint hum that rolled from the ridge, a sound that felt less like a song and more like a summons. Then came the snowstorm. Heavy, relentless, it buried the valley in white, isolating the town as surely as the hollow had isolated the Sutterfields for generations. Roads vanished beneath drifts, fences bent under the weight, and silence fell heavier than ever. It was in that silence that the children began to disappear. First a boy of 8, gone from his bed without a sound. His window latch still locked from the inside. No footprints in the snow. Then a girl of 12, vanished from her family's barn, though her father had been working not 10 feet away. He swore he heard no cry, only the sudden stillness of the cattle, their breath steaming in the cold. By the third child, panic broke like glass. Mothers wailed, fathers raged, but no one could explain how the hollow reached them in their own homes, their own barns, their own fields. The sheriff gathered what men remained and declared curfew. No one outside after dusk, lanterns in every window, rifles at the ready. Yet even as he gave the order, he knew it was like spitting into a storm. The hollow was not creeping closer. It was already here, and the town, whether it admitted it or not, had begun to disappear into it, one by one. The storm did not break for 5 days. Snow lay heavy across roofs and fields, muffling sound until even the cries of grief seemed swallowed whole. By the time the skies cleared, the town felt hollowed, like a body drained of blood. 3 children gone, Hensley gone, the searchers gone, each loss another nail hammered into the town's coffin. On the 6th day, Sheriff Vance called a meeting in the church. Few came, but those who did sat hunched in the cold pews, their faces pale in the flicker of lanterns. Mothers clutched their children close, men stared at the floor, and the preacher stood at the pulpit with hands that trembled though he tried to hide it. "We can't stay in this valley," one farmer said, his voice breaking the silence. "If we don't leave, there won't be any of us left." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but others shook their heads. "Leave," Another spat. Where to? These mountains are our home. My father's buried here, and his father before him. You think we can outrun them? The hollow's already in us. The sheriff raised his hand. Argin won't bring back the children, won't bring back Saul, or Hensley, or Ephraim. The question ain't whether we leave. The question is whether we fight. The word fight hung in the air, strange and heavy. No one wanted to speak it, but none could ignore it. Preacher Holcomb gripped the Bible so hard the cover bent. The Lord commands us to root out sin, to cut it off before it spreads. The Sutterfields are a curse, and curses must be broken. If we go to them as one body, in the name of God, we can cleanse what festers. A woman's voice cut through the stillness. Mary Klein, frail but unshaken, rose from her bench. You speak of cleansing, but you don't know what you're walking into. That family ain't bound by flesh alone. They're bound by something older, something deep in the mountain itself. You can't cleanse what the earth itself keeps. Her words chilled the room, yet desperation outweighed fear. By night's end, a decision was made. The town would march on the hollow. Not a handful this time, but every man who could carry a rifle, every woman who could light a torch. They would burn the cabins, scatter the kin, and end the curse at its root. 2 nights later, the valley stirred. Dozens gathered at the church, torches in hand, rifles slung across their backs. Mothers clutched babes to their chests. Fathers kissed children they might never see again. The preacher stood at the head, his voice rising in a hymn that quavered but did not falter. The sheriff walked beside him, jaw clenched, rifle gripped tight. The march began. Snow crunched beneath their boots, breath clouded the air, and the torches lit the road like a river of fire winding into the dark. The ridge loomed ahead, black against the starlit sky. No one spoke. Only the sound of the hymn carried, low and steady, a thread of hope stretched thin against dread. When they reached the lightning-struck oak, the sheriff raised his hand. From here on, no turning back. Faces nodded, pale and resolute. The torches lifted higher. They pushed into the trees, the narrow path swallowing them whole. The forest seemed to lean closer, branches scraping against shoulders, shadows twisting in the torchlight. Strange shapes hung from limbs, more dolls, more bones, more signs carved into bark. The warnings were clear, yet they pressed on, driven not by courage but by fear too deep to ignore. Then the chanting began, low at first, distant, but with each step it grew louder, the rhythm steady, inhuman. The words were indistinct, yet the cadence was familiar, echoing the dreams that had haunted the sheriff, the whispers that had driven Ephraim to the creek. Blood binds us. Blood keeps us. Blood calls. The posse broke into the hollow like a flood. Cabins loomed, their roofs sagging, smoke curling from chimneys. Figures emerged from the shadows, thin, pale, eyes wide in the firelight. Men, women, children, all swaying to the chant. At their center stood Hester, her shawl wrapped tight, her black eyes catching the torchlight like obsidian. She raised her hands, and the chanting ceased. "You bring fire," she said, her voice slicing the cold. "But fire won't save you. Fire feeds us." The preacher lifted his Bible, his voice cracking as he shouted a verse. The sheriff raised his rifle. The townsfolk held their torches higher. The hollow exhaled. The Sutterfields surged forward, and the reckoning began. The first shot cracked like thunder. Smoke burst from the sheriff's rifle, the bullet tearing into the dark where a Sutterfield had lunged. The figure dropped, but the others did not flinch. They surged faster, their voices rising in a howl that was neither word nor song but something older, something primal. Torches swung. Flames licked at cabin walls, catching on dry wood and tar-patched roofs. Fire leapt skyward, sparks scattering into the black. The hollow, once damp and shadowed, blazed with orange light. The Sutterfields moved through it as though the flames did not touch them. Men with milky eyes rushed barehanded against rifles. Women shrieked with voices sharp enough to pierce bone. Children clung to the legs of townsfolk with teeth bared like animals. Sheriff Vance fought with grim precision, his rifle cracking, his knife flashing when hands clawed too close. He saw Hensley's wife scream as a pale boy tore the torch from her grasp. He saw the preacher clutch his Bible in one hand and swing an axe with the other, his hymn broken into raw cries. The air was chaos, smoke, fire, blood. Cabins collapsed one by one, flames devouring them. But the more the hollow burned, the more the Sutterfields seemed to multiply, their faces appearing in the smoke, their voices rising in chorus. The chant rolled louder, shaking the ground beneath the townsfolk's boots. Blood binds us. Blood keeps us. Blood calls. In the center of it all stood Hester. The fire framed her, her hair wild, her black eyes gleaming. She did not move, did not flinch, only raised her arms higher as if conducting the chant itself. "Strike her!" someone shouted. "End it with her!" The sheriff leveled his rifle. His breath caught, his finger tightened, and Hester's voice cut through the roar, cold as stone. "You think I made this? Fool! I only kept it. The hollow was here long before me. It will be here long after you." The rifle fired. The shot slammed into her chest. She staggered, shawl tearing, blood dark against her pale skin. For a moment, silence fell. Then Hester laughed. The sound was thin, jagged, carried on the crackle of fire. She spread her arms wider, blood spilling down her front, her voice rising until it drowned the flames themselves. "Now you're bound. All of you. Yours and theirs. Blood upon blood. It keeps. It calls. It keeps." The sheriff fired again. This time she fell, crumpling at the foot of the burning pit. The chant broke, a wail splitting from the kin as they swarmed, clawing, shrieking, throwing themselves into the fire as though following her. The townsfolk, terrified, broke too. Some fled down the ridge, torches scattering into the trees. Others fought wildly, striking anything that moved. The preacher screamed scripture until a pale hand dragged him into the blaze. Sheriff Vance stood in the inferno, his rifle empty, his knife slick. Smoke blinded him, screams deafened him. He saw faces, his wife, his son, Hensley, Miller, all twisted into the chanting, their mouths moving in time with the dead. The fire consumed the hollow, devouring cabin after cabin, beam after beam. The sky glowed red, sparks rising like souls unmoored. By dawn, the ridge was black ash and ruin. The hollow, once hidden, was gone, but so too were half the townsfolk who had marched. No bodies lay in the ash. No bones. Only footprints circling the pit, dozens, hundreds, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The survivors staggered down the ridge, silent, hollow-eyed. Not one spoke of what they had seen, what they had heard. Not one dared. Yet in the sheriff's ears, even as he stumbled home, the chant lingered, steady as a heartbeat. Blood binds us. Blood keeps us. Blood calls. And he knew, with a certainty deeper than fear, that the fire had not ended it. The fire had fed it. The hollow did not die with the fire. Though the cabins had been reduced to ash, though the ground still bore the blackened scars of that night, the valley did not breathe easier. Instead, it seemed to draw tighter around itself, as if guarding a wound. Trees leaned inward, grass refused to grow where the pit had burned, and birds would not cross the ridge. The town below staggered on, scarred beyond repair. Of the dozens who had marched, fewer than half returned. Widows wept in their kitchens, fathers sat silent on their porches, children asked questions no one dared answer. Sheriff Vance held his post, but moved like a man already buried, his eyes dark with sleepless nights. Each winter afterward, the snow seemed to fall heavier. Each spring, the fields yielded less. Families who could leave did so. Wagons creaked down the mountain roads, one after another, until only a thin scattering of houses remained. Clay County became a ghost town long before the maps marked it as such. Yet whispers endured. Travelers spoke of lights flickering on the ridge, though no houses stood there. Hunters claimed to hear chanting in the trees, low and steady, that sent their hounds whimpering. Children born in the valley sometimes vanished before their first birthday, their cribs empty, their footprints leading nowhere. And then there were the faces, seen in dreams, at first, pale shapes crowding the edges of sleep, their mouths moving in silence. But sometimes, on the darkest nights, when the moon hung low, they appeared in the windows of the last farmhouses, reflected in the glass. Watching, waiting. Sheriff Vance never spoke of what happened that night in the hollow, but as the years wore on, he changed. He began wandering the ridge alone, muttering under his breath. His wife found him once at the lightning-struck oak, carving words into the bark with his knife. Blood binds us. Blood keeps us. Blood calls. He died in his bed, though not at peace. His eyes were open, his lips stained red, as though whispering even in death. At his funeral, the preacher, an old man by then, his hair white, his hands trembling, refused to speak a blessing. The grave never stayed settled. Each spring, the earth above it sank deeper, as though drawing him down into the hollow's belly. Folks stopped visiting. The weeds grew tall. The stone cracked. Generations passed, but the Sutterfield name never vanished. Strangers would arrive in neighboring counties, pale, dark-eyed, speaking with strange lilts in their voices. No one knew where they came from. No one dared ask. Some married into new families, their blood mingling, their children born with eyes too dark, voices that hummed in their sleep. And still, in the quiet hours, the chant returned, passed in whispers, hummed in barns, murmured by children in play. Blood binds us. Blood keeps us. Blood calls. Those who left Clay County tried to forget. They built lives in distant towns, spoke of farms and factories, never mountains. Yet even there, the legacy crept. An accident on a railway, a fire in a schoolhouse, a missing child in a city far away. Each one whispered to bear the same mark, though none dared speak the name aloud. The Sutterfields were never gone. The hollow was never gone. It lived in blood, in bone, in memory. And if you stand on the ridge today, where the oak still leans against the sky, you may hear it too. The wind carries it soft, almost gentle, like a lullaby. But if you listen long enough, if you let it into your chest, you'll understand. It does not beg. It does not ask. It calls, and blood always answers. The hollow is silent now, but the story doesn't end here. Join me at Eternal Obsidian for more tales buried in shadow. Hit subscribe and step deeper into the dark.